Hello, this is John Bodden, historian at Oregon State University, and today I'm going to discuss the history of beer in 18th and 19th century Europe with a focus on the industrialization of brewing as well as the creation of three beer styles: Porter, India Pale Ale, and Pilsner. Here we see a group of English tradespeople who are spinning thread and weaving cloth in their home. Like beer, clothes were made in cottage industries across the United Kingdom during the medieval period, but then it began to change in the 18th century. New machines for spinning thread and weaving fabric displaced artisans manufacturing goods at home. Increasingly, large urban factories are where textiles got manufactured. And the same thing could be said for beer. Industrialization is the process by which a society vastly increases its powers of material production using machines powered by fossil fuels. The process began in England during the late 18th century and spread globally. Industrialization facilitated the brewing of beer on a massive scale, as well as its transport to faraway markets. Coal-powered steam engines, developed by Scottish engineer James Watt, created a stable new source of power that liberated humans from their traditional reliance on wind, water, and muscles. At roughly the same time, James Watt patented his steam engine, a new instrument for measuring the natural world came to beer brewing. The hydrometer is a device for measuring the sugars in wort. Such an instrument allowed brewers to determine the exact alcohol content of their beer, and it came into regular use by commercial brewers during the late 18th century. And like the thermometer, it provided a new measure of precision and control over the brewing process. It is connected to both the scientific and industrial revolutions. Another major development related to England's industrialization process was the kilning of higher quality malt using coke or purified coal rather than traditional wood fires. As you might guess, malt kilned using coal or firewood will retain some of the unpleasant flavors of the fuel itself. In contrast, coke did not impart unpleasant flavors, and maltsters in northern England started producing high-quality pale and brown malts. Here is an image of brown malt, which is the raw ingredient used to brew porter. Porter is a dark style of beer, first brewed in London in the early 18th century. Several characteristics made porter distinctive. It was originally brewed with 100% brown malt, aged in barrels, and generously hopped. It's a symbol of the industrial age for being the first beer brewed at an industrial scale, using hydrometers and thermometers. It was the first beer style to be exported around the world, and makes some of its brewers fabulously wealthy. The drink's name is believed to have originated with London's porters, who enjoy the beverage after a long day of carrying other people's things around the city. Samuel Whitbread was the first brewer to use a steam engine for making beer. Whitbread employed copper pipes to cool his beer, steam engines to grind the malt, mash it, and pump the wort. His brewery embodied a new kind of industrial brewing. The nature of porter brewing, with its lengthy required storage, lent itself to large-scale production. Over time, the increased use of the steam engine and the ability to refrigerate beer also contributed to brewing of large batches of beer with consistent quality and stability. And I should also mention, Samuel Whitbread got rich brewing porter beer. Arthur Guinness was an 18th century Irish entrepreneur who also brewed porter or stout in Dublin at a brewery that would become one of the largest and best known in the world. He exported his Guinness overseas, and his brand remains well known in our time. Like Samuel Whitbread, he emerged during the Industrial Revolution and adopted its technology. Porter beers, with their generous hop content, possessed a longer shelf life and could be exported to faraway places. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia from 1762 to 1796, developed a taste for strong, dark beers from Britain and imported large quantities of them for the Russian court. The demand encouraged English brewers to create strong, robust porters that would survive the long journey to Russia. At some point, they became known as Russian Imperial Stouts. Here is the label for Courage Russian Imperial Stout, and another label from North Coast Brewing, a California craft brewery in the 21st century. Stout is a cousin of porter, and stout beers such as Russian Imperial Stout are highly alcoholic, highly hopped, and very flavorful. Typically, they're darker than porter and contain more pronounced notes of coffee or chocolate. One early 19th century maltster, Daniel Wheeler, developed a new method of imparting color to dark beer. Take the malt and roast it in an iron drum at high temperatures, 400 degrees, in a revolving motion similar to the roasting of coffee. Due to this intense roasting process, black patent malt is primarily used for color and flavor rather than contributing fermentable sugars to the brewing process. Brewers typically use it in relatively small amounts compared to other malts in their recipes, and this development provided more control to brewers. Again, we see a theme. Someone like Arthur Guinness II embraced the new technology of brewing in the 19th century to ensure quality and consistency in his stout beer. He transformed a local Irish brewery into a global powerhouse. Under his management, the St. James Gate Brewery in Dublin grew to become the largest brewery in Ireland and one of the largest in the world. He introduced new brewing techniques and modernized the production process. This engraving of the Barclay and Perkins Brewery in London takes you inside of an English brewery. You can see the massive wooden conditioning vats. Production volume dwarfed anything from the pre-industrial era, and most breweries had stables of horses to transport their beer barrels to taverns around the city. Brewing was getting big in the UK. In 1886, Arthur Guinness brewed 1 million barrels of beer. Now, I've already explained that British maltsters had started using heated air from coke ovens to dry their malt, and not firewood or charcoal. Pale malt is kilned at lower temperatures to produce a light color and clean, malty flavor. And one particular location in Britain produced the very best pale ales. Burton-on-Trent is a town in England with mineral-rich spring water. Such hard water encouraged a strong fermentation of the beer and drew the best qualities out of the hops. London's water, in contrast, was better suited for brown ale. Eventually, dozens of brewers came to Burton-on-Trent to make pale ale. Their brews gained a special reputation not only in the UK, but also overseas. So the town, Burton-on-Trent, is significant because it illustrates the importance of water for brewing, export markets for distinctive beer, and its place as the brewing capital of the world in the late 19th century. A quick point to make here is that Europeans did not have precise measurements of the mineral content of their water supplies, but they increasingly understood the importance of water for brewing outcomes. The Bass Brewery, founded by William Bass and Burton-on-Trent, is synonymous with the town's legendary pale ales. By the late 19th century, Bass was producing over 1 million barrels annually. Bass also marketed its product with an immediately recognizable red triangle on its casks and bottles. So the brewery pioneered international marketing strategies and came to symbolize high-quality pale ale produced in Burton-on-Trent. Here's an impressionistic painting by Edward Manet of a Parisian bar. On the bottom left and right, there are bottles of Bass Pale Ale. Before railroads and steamships, most breweries produced beer to satisfy the local market. Now savvy producers in Burton-on-Trent and Dublin or London were finding markets for their product on every continent. Noteworthy among these overseas destinations was South Asia. Until the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Passage from England to India took anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the conditions, and the voyage involved sailing around the southern tip of Africa. India Pale Ale is a style of beer designed to survive a long journey from England to India. Brown ales and porters tended to arrive sour and flat after the long sea journey. In contrast, India Pale Ales, or IPAs, were brewed with twice as many hops as a typical pale ale, and they were brewed to have at least a 6% alcohol content by volume. London brewers exported the drink in 1800 before Burton-on-Trent brewers came to dominate the trade by the 1830s, and eventually the style caught on in Britain itself before declining around 1900. Happily, American craft brewers revived the style in the 1990s, and IPAs have enjoyed a nice resurgence ever since. Before we leave Burton-on-Trent, I will comment that the city became known as a brewing capital during the 19th century because so many internationally known breweries operated there, such as Worthington's, Bass, Marston's, and Alsop. In Ireland, Dublin's Guinness Brewery had become truly massive, one of the world's largest producers and a major exporter of beer to overseas markets. British ales, these top fermented beers with robust taste, might have seemed unbeaten in the global marketplace given the size of British brewers and their seeming preponderance of global influence. But developments in Germany would rapidly change that during the second half of the 19th century. In southern Germany, brewers had gradually developed a new kind of yeast strand, Saccharomyces pastorianus, that fermented its brew at the bottom of the barrel. And crucially, its brewers stored the beer at nearly freezing temperatures for months. Southern Germany's proximity to the Alps meant the area had a ready supply of natural ice that could be used to keep beer cellars and caves cold year-round. The resulting beer tasted different than ale. Lager is a clean, smooth beer that has been fermented at cold temperatures with bottom fermenting yeasts. Lager gets its name from the German word lagern, meaning to store, because the beer requires longer storage and at lower temperatures than ale. About 90% of the beer consumed worldwide is lager. Before artificial refrigeration, lager was fermented in caves or underground cellars with blocks of ice, and its production was generally restricted to cooler regions with access to ice. So German brewers were experimenting with lager yeasts in the 19th century, but their kilning technology was rudimentary in comparison to that of the British Isles. Before the 1840s, most Central European beers were brown in color because the malt kilns burned wood or charcoal and imparted those colors and flavors to the malt. Two friends, Gabriel Sedlmayr II of Munich and Anton Dreyer of Vienna, came from brewing families, and they wanted to understand why British malt was different. Why did ale from Burton-on-Trent taste so distinctive? How did the British produce their malt? They were curious, and together the two friends visited various British breweries in 1833 and collectively put the information they gathered to good use. One might even say they were engaged in industrial espionage. Well, in 1841, Anton Dreyer introduced his Vienna lager. It was the first commercial pale lager, depending on one's definition of pale. Inspired by English pale malting techniques, Dreyer used high-quality Moravian barley to develop a new type of malt, also called Vienna malt, and then he used it to brew a reddish-amber lager. Vienna lager became immediately popular throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By 1860, Dreyer's brewery was producing 20 times as much beer as it had in the 1830s, and Dreyer became a wealthy and influential man. Gabriel Sedlmayr developed Marzen beer at the same time his friend Anton Dreyer created Vienna lager. Marzen beer, known for its balanced maltiness and smooth, drinkable character, as well as its clean, dry finish, was an immediate hit at Munich's Oktoberfest in 1841, and widely celebrated thereafter. It gets its name from March, the month it is brewed, and then lagered or stored until Oktoberfest in September. The Czech Republic, once a region called Bohemia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is a beer-drinking region in Central Europe and home to one of the noble hops, Saaz hops. In the late 1830s, inhabitants of Pilsen, a Bohemian city, had become unhappy with the quality of their locally brewed beer, and so its citizens formed a committee devoted to establishing a new brewery with outstanding beer. One fateful committee decision was to hire the best talent for the project, and the best talent at that time was in Bavaria. Joseph Groll is the name of a Bavarian brewmaster recruited by Pilsen citizens to help them brew their beer. Groll brought to Pilsen Bavarian lager yeast and used it with the region's distinctive ingredients. The results were extraordinary and would impact beer brewing worldwide. Pilsner is a clear golden lager with a snow-white foam head, first brewed by Joseph Groll in 1842. The beer's distinctive qualities come from Bohemia's sweet barley, Saaz hops, and Pilsen's soft water that lacks the high mineral content of other cities. Pilsner's popularity made it an important model for many other lagers, which, as I've said, lager beers today account for over 90% of worldwide production. Pilsner influenced the creation of similar beer styles such as Hellslager in Munich and Bitburger in Bitburg, Germany. You could say that lager beer had triumphed in Central Europe. Meanwhile, millions of Germans immigrated to the United States in search of opportunity in the decades following the 1840s. Among the Germans who immigrated to the United States include Friedrich Miller, Frederick Pabst, Adolphus Busch, and Joseph Schlitz. They all brought their taste for lager beer with them. Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Milwaukee became major destinations for beer-drinking Germans. And wherever Germans went, they brought lager yeast and created cellars with harvested ice to store their bottom-fermenting beers. Germans also went to Latin America, where they established successful breweries in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Lager beers, and especially those of a light and crisp quality, are everywhere today, from Africa and Asia to Europe and the Americas. You could say that 19th century pale lagers conquered the world. Here are the sources I relied on for this lecture. I look forward to your comments and questions.